Hey adventurers, so today is going to be a little bit different type of video. It's going to be a recommendation video, which I do these types of things occasionally, but not terribly often. And the reason why it's different is because I'm kind of going to be recommending books that I don't hear many people talk about, whether it's because they haven't been read by a ton of people, or they're just not the type of books that get talked about a ton. These are just books that I have talked about quite a bit actually, but I don't see a whole lot of other people talking about them. And I just wanted to, maybe this video will reach different people than my reviews and whatnot do. So it's just going to be whatever books I can come up with. I've only taken 5, I've only pulled 5 off my shelves, but that means it's just a short curated list that maybe you guys will find something interesting in that you haven't read yet. I don't have these ranked or anything like that. They're just books that are off the shelf in whatever order they came off the shelf, or rather the backwards order. The one that I took off first is on the bottom of the pile, and the one that I took off last is on the top of the pile. So we will start with that, and the first one that I have then is Gawain by J.P. Harker. So this is one where it's an Arthurian. I wanted to include an Arthurian on this video because I don't see a ton of Arthurian content out there, even though at least in the booktube specific sphere. I know there's a lot of people who read a lot of Arthurian content. There's some other great ones that I've read, some classics of the Arthurian literature genre that I have read and that I've really loved and that I could promote, but I wanted to do this one specifically because, well, for one, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is probably my favorite story, and definitely my favorite Arthurian story, Arthurian tale. And so Gawain by J.P. Harker is a retelling of that, kind of geared a little bit more YA than adult. It's definitely not just tropey YA fantasy like that subgenre is known for, or age category is known for. It's not YA as a genre, it's more YA as a age category in this instance, I guess. This is a retelling of the Sir Gawain and the Green Knight tale, and done in a different way, in basically a way so that it's a piece of a larger epic fantasy narrative, or larger epic narrative surrounding the Arthurian mythos, surrounding Arthur and his knights and the Round Table and the establishment of that Round Table and everything. This is before Arthur has really come into his own, and it doesn't even include Arthur. This is about Gawain. Eventually there will be other books in this series, and they haven't come out yet, and so I haven't read them yet, but I do want to continue on with them once they do come out. The next one I have on the pile is A Natural History of Dragons, a memoir by Lady Trent. This is a series by Marie Brennan. Actually, I don't know if you can see them, but I have the first 4 books in the series. It's a 5-book series, and I have read all the 5 books in the series. There's one offshoot book that I haven't read yet. But basically, this is about a girl who, throughout her childhood, was obsessed with figuring out how things worked. Essentially, the science and the biology of creatures, of birds, of beasts, of winged beasts specifically, and that grows into a love of dragons and a desire to study dragons. And so this is a memoir of her going to study dragons, not the actual scientific research paper type thing of A Natural History of Dragons. But even with that title and that expectation going in, I came out of this book and this series absolutely loving them for its very Victorian style world building, or Regency style world building. I'm not sure which specifically, because I'm still unclear on the difference between the two, but it's that very much Jane Austen feeling world, but with dragons inserted. It's not set on Earth. It is very analogous to Earth in many ways, but it just a different world. There's the world map there. There's illustrations all throughout these books that are fantastic, and though it's low magic, it is very heavy on the, I guess what I'm trying to say here is the the way that the dragons are inserted into this book and into the series is not as a magical mythical being, but rather a natural part of the world and the environment, and oftentimes considered pests. And just the way that they're done in that way, it's the only other series that I can specifically think of that does this type of thing is the How to Train Your Dragon series, both the movies and the books. Although even those are a little bit more magical than what we see in these books. This is very scientific in its approach to looking at dragons, and I really do appreciate that. The next book I have, and another one that I have talked about quite a bit, and actually the review of this is my most viewed video on the channel, It's actually a review of the series, but that is On the Edge of the Dark Sea of Darkness, or the Wingfeather Saga as a whole. And I love this book and the series. Honestly, I was drawn to the book because of the title. I don't know when I first heard the title, but several years ago I heard the title On the Edge of the Dark Sea of Darkness somewhere, or read it somewhere or something like that, and it stuck in my mind, and it's been one that I've wanted to read for a very, very long time. Eventually it came up in a book club that I was doing, and I was told, oh, you should read this book, and we read it for the book club, and I really enjoyed it. I didn't love every aspect of it. Book 2 I actually loved a lot more. Book 2 is my favorite of the series, although there is a Wingfeather Tales, which is a collection of short stories set in the world of Erudite, and some of those stories, specifically the final story in that book, which is titled The Place Beyond the Maps, that is my favorite piece of Wingfeather content I've ever consumed. And anyways, On the Edge of the Dark Sea of Darkness it's a middle grade series about a bunch of about the Igby children and their adventures and their adventure through, I guess I mentioned adventure, but their attempt to survive and to become the people that they are supposed to be. It is Christian fiction, and you can see those themes coming out pretty clearly, but it's not done in a way that's preachy, and I do appreciate that a lot. So a different series in some ways, or a different type of series in some ways than most people have read, but at the same time it feels very high, very epic. At the same time, it's enjoyable to adults, but it is clearly written for a middle grade audience, and I'm glad to see that a book that is clearly written for a middle grade audience can still be as enjoyable to an adult audience as this one was. The fourth book and series in this video that I'm going to talk about is another one that I have talked quite a bit about because I read it and I feel like it's very, very underrated, but it's also it feels very familiar in many ways, but it's also very different, and I will mention that a little bit more in a second here. But that series is The Runelords by David Farland, or the first book is The Sum of All Men. It's usually just called The Runelords, but this is just a super interesting, The Runelords, The Sum of All Men. So it's a very interesting series in that David Farland is actually fairly well known in the writer community. I mean, he was a mentor to Brandon Sanderson. He actually taught the class that Sanderson is now teaching, and he's one of those people that pretty much anybody in the fantasy community, or in the fantasy writing community, knows who David Farland was, but nobody talks about his books on the BookTube side of things. In fact, like, I'd heard of them somewhere. Somehow I'd heard about these books because I heard somebody talking about them, or hauled the first book in the series or something like that. And so it was in my mind, and then when I saw the first book at a used bookstore, I was like, all right, I'm gonna get this because I want to see what it's like. It turns out it wasn't the person who I thought it was, but still, I ended up reading the series with Nico from Nico's Book Reviews, and we had just a great time with it. Lots of great discussion to go along with the books. It's currently an 8-book series. The 9th book was not written before, or was not published before the death of the author. And if it ever is, I'm absolutely going to be reading it. But it hasn't been published yet, and I do hope it does, because there's some things that need to be wrapped up still. But the first 4 books in this series are one arc that really, it doesn't take very long. It doesn't take place over a very long period of time. I don't know the exact timeline, but I know several of the books are like over the course of 24 to 48 hours or something like that, 1 to 2 days. And they just, because of the way that the world is designed and built and the magic system works, you can tell the entire story in that short of amount of time with these massive world-changing, world-affecting consequences that there are. And it's really interesting, it's really deep in many ways. There's a level of darkness to this series that obviously it's adult fantasy, and so you do expect some of that, but there's a level of darkness to it that it's not blatant and in your face. It is done in such a way so that it forces the reader to actually have to think about these questions. There's some philosophical questions that are asked in this series throughout the entirety of the series, and you, the reader, have to answer them for yourself. And it's really cool the way that that's done, but it's also just very high, very epic fantasy. The first 4 books are an arc. The 5th book is kind of like a bridge book that bridges the gap between this first arc and the second arc, and then books 6, 7, and 8 are that last arc, with 9 supposed to be wrapping up that last arc in the series as a whole, if 9 is ever released. But very different in many ways, very familiar at the same time because it is that epic fantasy. At least, especially this first book, feels very familiar in terms of tone, in terms of world building. But the more you dig into this world, the more you find out this is very different, and I really like it. So that is number 4. And the 5th one is a book that I love, absolutely love. It's by my favorite author, and it's a book that really people don't talk about unless you are specifically in the Tolkien community. And of course, Tolkien is the author that I'm talking about, and the book is The Children of Huron. This is his darkest novel in many ways. It's a tragedy. It's very heartbreaking. It's very sad. Basically, you're following a family that's cursed by the Dark Lord, and then cursed again by a dragon, and by the father of dragons specifically. And as you follow this character's stories, it primarily follows Turin, who is the son of Huron, but it also follows his sister, which is, what is his sister's name? Nienor is his sister. Anyways, continuing on discussing why I think people should read this book. It's, as I mentioned, it's one of his darkest works. It's tragedy through and through. There's no happy endings whatsoever, but it's so well done, and the level of tragedy that it just piles on top of itself, and you understand why this story is important to the world, the ramifications of this story are still coming into play in The Lord of the Rings, just like most of the stories from the First Age do. But this book also has a sentient sword, and sentient swords are about my favorite trope in fantasy, and it's not prominent in the same way that like Nightblood is in Warbreaker or something like that, but the sword is sentient. The sword does play a very important role in the story. There's just, I mean, it's got an awesome dragon, a terrifying dragon, and it's got epic world building, lots of detail, lots of great character development and stuff like that. And it's a really cool story. It's a very dark, very sad story, and it's my favorite story that Tolkien wrote. This book was not published by Tolkien himself. It was edited and published by Christopher Tolkien after the death of John Ronald Reuel, or Jolkin Rolkin. But let's see, when was this published exactly? The book was published 2007, I believe. Was when The Children of Huron was released, and I'm very glad that it was, because it's amazing. It's very, like with anything that Tolkien wrote, it's incredible, but it's dark. I do definitely recommend this book as well, though, because it's very different from The Lord of the Rings, but it's also very different from a lot of the other works a lot of the other epic fantasy works that I've ever read. It does have a bit of a grimdark aspect to this story, without being gore and language all throughout. It's clean fantasy, but it's dark and it's disturbing, and it's very, very good. I like tragedies. So those are the 5 books on this list of different recommendations. I don't remember exactly what I'm calling this. I'll have the title eventually once I get this edited. But this is a video idea that I've thought about for a long time, and as I've continued to read books, I've continued to find more and more that I'm like, I do want to put on this list. So I'm glad that I'm finally able to do this video. Hopefully you found a new recommendation, or one that you're interested in reading. Thank you guys for watching an Erudite Adventure. We post videos every Monday and Thursday, and have our social medias linked in the description down below. We'll see you guys again soon. Stay warm.